Stomping his way into the Beastgrave, Ogre Hunter Hrothgorn Mantrapper leads his warband to glory. In this video we're going to show you exactly how to paint these fantastic Citadel miniatures using easy to follow step-by-step painting guides so you can have your warband done in no time at all. So grab your paints and let's get started. To prepare our models for painting, we've already undercoated them. For Hrothgorn, the Gnobler Trappers and the Mantrap itself, we've undercoated them with Mechanicus Standard Grey Spray. As for Thrafnir, the Faithful Sabertusk, we've undercoated him with Grey Seer. But more on those later, because first up we're going to be starting on Hrothgorn himself, and the first colour we're going to use is Dark Reaper to paint his trousers. So grab your medium layer brush and let's get started. So first of all, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, and just add it onto our palette like this. Take a touch of water, like this, just to thin our paint down, maybe a bit more. Perfect. Then, onto the model, just going to very carefully paint Dark Reaper all over Hrothgorn's trousers. Now, throughout this video, you want to try and be as neat as you possibly can when you're painting your model. Try not to go over the edges and hit other areas, but if you do, don't worry, you can always go back later on and correct your mistakes. Once this base coat's been applied, we'll move on to the next stage. And there we go, that's our first base coat applied. So now it's time to finish off those trousers. I'm going to start off with a layer of Thunderhawk Blue. Then we'll add a layer of Rust Grey and finally a highlight of Fenrisian Grey. But first of all it's that Thunderhawk Blue, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. Now we're going to take a little paint from the pot here, not too much, and we're going to add quite a lot of water. And the reason we're doing this is we want this paint to be quite thin. I want the transition between the two colours to be quite subtle, and the thinner it is, the better that will be. So there we go, that's nice and thin. Then onto our trousers, we're just going to very carefully paint the layers in like so. So we're just leaving the Dark Reaper colour showing in the darker areas nearer the thigh here and also in the deeper recesses of the trousers, just bringing that forwards there towards the knee. Next up we're adding a layer of Rust Grey, again quite heavily thinned down with water here, again just on top of the Thunderhawk Blue here, just a nice subtle colour here, just aiming towards the knees and the raised parts of the trousers. And the last colour on the trousers is Fenrisian Grey, which we're applying as a fine line highlight on the raised areas of the trousers. With that, Hrothgorn's trousers are painted and the first part of the model is complete. So now it's time to move on to the next stage, and for this we're painting our Ogre's flesh. We're going to start off with a base coat of Cadian Flesh Tone, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. So let's get straight to it. Again, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, and put it onto the palette here. Now, we want to thin it down, but not too much. This is a layer paint, not a base paint, so we don't want too thin a coat. About that, that's perfect. Then onto the miniature, we're going to very carefully paint Cadian Flesh Tone all over the flesh areas of our Ogre. Now, like I said before, this is going to be quite a thin coat here, so you may find you need a couple of thinner coats to get a really solid colour, but once you've done that, we'll move on to the next stage. And there we go, with the base coat applied, it's time to move on to the next stage of the flesh. And up next we're going to be using a contrast paint, Fireslayer Flesh, mixed with contrast medium all over the flesh. Once that's dry, we're going to move on to using Cadian Flesh Tone, Kislev Flesh and Flavorn Flesh, all mixed with Lamy medium to highlight the flesh up. So first of all it's time for that Fireslayer Flesh stage of contrast paint, and for this we're using our medium shade brush, so let's get straight to it. Now first of all we're going to take a little bit of paint out the pot like so and add it to our palette like this. About one brushful is perfect. Then we're going to wash our brush off, make sure there's no Fireslayer Flesh left on the brush. Just wash it off there. Perfect. Then we're going to take about 2 or 3 brushfuls of contrast medium here from the pot and then just mix them in like so. We're doing this to get a really nice thin contrast paint here to make it nice and subtle on the flesh. Then onto our Ogre, we're just going to paint it very carefully all over our flesh like so. Now you can afford to put quite a thick layer on here, so just add as much as you like, but watch out as you're adding the contrast paint on that it doesn't pull together in the recesses. You can see here in his armpit, you don't want it gathering together like that, so just use your brush to move it around. Once this is dry, it'll take about half an hour to dry, and so once it has, we'll move on to the next stage, which is going to be start layering it up. Next up, we're using Cadian Flesh Tone again, this time slightly thinned down with Lamy and medium, and we're just going to be layering on over the muscles like this. So be very careful, just leave the recessed areas the darker colour, which we've already painted on, and just build up the colour on the higher muscles like this. Next up we're adding another layer, this time with Kislev Flesh, again mixed with Lamy and medium, just onto the raised parts of the muscles here. And last but not least, on the flesh, we're adding another highlight, this time of flayed one flesh, again with a touch of lamy medium here, not too much. I'm just going to be highlighting the very edges of the muscle. Nice subtle highlights just like this. When it comes to the face, you might want a bit of stronger highlights, so perhaps a bit of flayed one flesh without the lamy medium in, just on the larger ridges of the face. And with that highlight done, the flesh of Hrothgorn is just about done. There's only one thing left we're going to do here, and that's to apply a wash of Caribou Crimson to his bottom lip to define it a little bit. So for this we're using our medium layer brush. Let's get to it. So here we're going to take a little bit of Caribou Crimson out of the pot like this. I'm just going to wipe off a little bit onto the palette like this. We're not going to water it down. I'm just going to make sure there's not too much paint on the brush. Then very carefully onto his bottom lip, we're just going to apply Caribou Crimson there, just very carefully like that. And with that done, Hrothgorn's face and flesh is fully painted. Alright, now it's time to move on to the next stage, and that's the wood on the model on both the crossbow stock and the handle of his big knife. For this we're going to be using Rhinox hide as a base coat, with Mournfang brown as a layer, and finally Xandri dust as a highlight. Again, we're using our medium layer brush here, so let's get to it. We're going to take a little bit of our Rhinox hide here out of the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Again, we're going to thin it down just a touch with a little bit of water, like that. Perfect. Then onto our model, we're going to be painting all the areas of wood. So have a good look around the model. You want the crossbow stock here, and there's the big knife on his back as well, the handle sticking out, to make sure you get that too. We're also going to paint the bowstrings of the crossbow too. We'll come back to those later on. Next up, we're adding a layer of Mournfang brown onto the wood, and we're going to be applying it with a medium layer brush in stripes along the grain of the wood like this. Try and be as neat as you possibly can. Don't worry if you make a mistake, your stripes can be as thick as you like. I'm going to make mine quite thick here. Also make sure you're applying these layers along the edges of the wood as well, just to really bring out the shape of that stock. Next up, we're using a small layer brush to add very fine lines of Xandri dust inside the stripes of Mournfang brown we just painted. So very, very carefully, just highlight inside the Mournfang brown like that, especially making sure you're highlighting around the very edges of the stock, such as here as well. And there we go, that's the wood on our ogre painted. So up next we're going to be painting the loincloth on our ogre, and that's going to start off with a base coat of Galvoback red. We'll give it a wash of Nuln oil before layering back up with Galvoback red and Wordbearer red before giving a highlight of Squig orange. For all of this we're going to be using our medium layer brush, so let's get straight onto it. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like this and just add it onto the palettes like so. Again, just a little bit of water just to thin it down, and then onto the loincloth of our ogre. We're just going to paint very carefully like so. Now this is going to be quite thin here, that's fine. It might take a couple of coats to go a nice solid colour. Once it's dry, we'll move on to the next stage. Next up, we're going to apply a wash of Nuln oil over the loincloth. Once the wash is dry, we're going to be applying another layer of Galvoback red, this time applying it only onto the raised areas of the loincloth, just in the centre like this, avoiding the deeper areas. Next up, we're using Wordbearer red, again to apply a layer onto the higher areas of the loincloth. Just drag the brush down here onto the raised areas like so, and apply the nice highlight like that. And last, on the loincloth, we're using a small layer brush to apply a fine highlight of Squig orange just inside the layers we've already painted. And there we go, with that the loincloth is painted. Up next, we're going to be painting the dark leather that appears on the strap around his shoulder, the big bag on his back, his belt, and the straps around his boots. And for this, we're going to be starting off with a base coat of Dryad bark. We'll hit it with a wash of Nuln oil before relayering with Dryad bark and then highlighting with Gawthor brown and Tallarn sand. But first of all, it's that Dryad bark stage, and for this, we're using our medium layer brush. So first of all, we're going to take a little bit of paint out the pot like so, add it to our palette. Just a little bit of water here, just to help the paint flow onto the miniature better. Perfect. And then onto our model. Just going to very carefully apply it to the leather areas we're after. So this is the straps around his shoulders here. Don't forget there's also a strap going up this side of his shoulder as well. Also the large sack on his back and any straps and his belt as well. Next up, we're applying a wash of Nuln oil to all those areas we've just painted. Next up, we thin down some Dryad bark with a touch of water, and we're relayering over the raised areas on the bag. We're also going to use this to add a highlight to the strap areas, so on the straps, just concentrate near the edges of the straps like this. Next up, we're applying a highlight of Gawthor brown to the very edges of the leather. Here we've watered it down slightly to make it super easy to go on, and you want really thin lines going inside the highlights we've already applied. Next up, we're using a small layer brush to add super fine highlights of Talon sand to the edges of the dark leather we've already painted. Again, here you're wanting to paint small highlights inside the highlights you previously painted. And there we go. With that leather done, it's time to move on to the rest of the leather on the miniature. This is on his cap, the gauntlet on his left arm, and various other straps on the miniature we haven't yet painted. For this, we're going to start with a lighter brown, Mournfang brown as a base coat, then we'll wash it with Agrat's Earthshade, reapply a layer of Mournfang brown, and then highlight it with XV88. For all of this, we're using our medium layer brush, so let's get straight to it. Again, we're taking a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, adding a touch of water, and then onto the miniature, just applying it very carefully onto the areas we want. So this is the cap on his head here, there's a gauntlet on his left arm here, and also other various straps, such as the straps underneath the bow here, and also on the handle of his knife here. Next up, we're applying a wash of Agrat's Earthshade to these areas. Here we're using a medium layer brush just to make sure we're not hitting any other areas of the model. Up next, we're applying a highlight of Mournfang brown again, which we've slightly thinned down with water. This is going onto the edges and the raised areas of all the leather we've just painted. Next up, we've switched to a small layer brush here to apply a super fine highlight of XV88 to the very edges of the leather we've just painted. Here we're trying to paint a nice fine highlight inside those highlights we just painted, so nice fine lines, as fine as you can here. And with that highlight done, the brown leather areas of our ogre are complete. So up next, it's time to paint the black areas of our model, and this is actually for two areas, the shoes and his beard. We're going to do them at the same time. We'll start off with a base coat of Abaddon black, then we'll highlight with Corvus black, then Eshin grey, and finally Dawnstone. So first of all, it's that Abaddon black, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. Just got a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, again onto our palette. Just going to add a little bit of water here, and then onto the miniature. Just going to paint very carefully onto the shoes. This is the leather areas of the shoes here. Make sure you avoid the metal bits, although we are painting over those later, so don't worry too much. And also we're going to paint his beard with this colour as well. Now if you're feeling adventurous and you fancy it as well, and you've got a thin enough brush, we're also going to blacken his eyes with this colour at the same time. Next up on the black areas, we're applying a thick highlight of Corvus black to the raised areas. We've watered it down slightly here to make this colour a little bit more subtle. Use Eshin grey and a small layer brush to add highlights inside the ones we've just painted. Don't forget to highlight the beard at the same time. The last highlight for the black areas is Dawnstone. Here we've watered it down slightly and we're using a small layer brush to add really thin highlights inside those we've already applied. Up next, we're painting the white fur our Ogre Hunter wears on his back and on his boots, and for this we'll start off with a base coat of Grey Seer. We'll dry brush the fur with Praxeti White, then we'll add a contrast paint, Apothecary White over the top, before a final dry brush of Praxeti White again. Now for the first base coat of Grey Seer, we're using our medium base brush, so let's get straight to that. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot as always, and just add a little bit of water here, like that, and then onto the miniature, we're just going to carefully paint the Grey Seer all over the fur parts of the miniature. Now have a really good look as you're painting to make sure you don't miss any parts. You've got fur all over the boots here as well, and also fur down the bottom here, just at the bottom of the cloak too. Okay, next up we're applying a dry brush over the top of that grey, and for this we're using a dry paint, Praxeti White, that's specifically designed for dry brushing. We're also going to be using our small dry brush here, so let's get straight to that. We're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, and with a dry brush paint, we're just going to wipe most of it off onto the piece of tissue paper like so, just making sure there's not much left on the brush. There we go, that's perfect. Then onto the model, we're carefully going to just brush lightly over the top of the grey like so. You can see it's picking out the fur parts like that. Let's very carefully apply the dry brush all over. Try as hard as you can not to hit any other parts of the model, but you can always go back later on and correct it if you do. Next up we're applying a contrast paint. This is Apothecary White going over the top of the dry brush we've just done. We're using a medium shade brush here and we're applying quite a thick coat on and allowing it to dry. Make sure as you're applying this on that it's not pooling together in areas. See at the bottom here, I'm just going to dab the brush there to make sure it's not grouping together or pooling. So take about 20 minutes to dry, and once it has, we'll move on to the next stage. Once the contrast paint is dry, we're just going to add another cheeky light highlight over the top with a dry brush. This is Praxeti White again. We're using a small dry brush here and just very gently flick over the top to pick out some of the lighter parts of the fur. And with that final dry brush done, the fur is complete. So next up, it's the toughened animal hide that makes up the rest of Crossbones Cloak, and for this we're going to start off with a base coat of Steel Legion Drab. Then we'll layer up with both Baneblade Brown and Carrick Stone before finally adding a highlight with Flayed Flesh. So first of all, onto that Steel Legion Drab. So we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, onto our palette, and again just add a touch of water just to thin it down a little bit. Perfect. Then onto his cloak, we're just going to add it very carefully onto the back like so, making sure we're not hitting any of the parts we've already painted. Don't hit that white, we have to go back and repaint it. And also just take a little time here. You might find as well that this is quite a thin coat, so it may need a couple of coats to get a nice solid colour, but that's absolutely fine. Once that's dry, we'll move on to the layering stage. Next up, we're adding a layer of Baneblade Brown, which we've slightly watered down with a touch of water. Here we're just going to be applying it to the higher surfaces here, the ridges of the cloak here, leaving the deeper areas the original Steel Legion Drab colour. Next up, it's another layer, this time Carrick Stone. We've also thinned this down with quite a bit of water. We're just adding it to the lighter areas at the very tops of the ridges of the cloak. And next up, we're adding a very fine highlight to the very tips and ridges of the cloak here using Flayed Flesh, which we've slightly watered down to make sure it goes on very subtly. We're using a small layer brush here to make sure our highlights are super fine. With the animal hide done, it's time to move on to the next stage of the miniature, and this is going to be the metal that's all over, from the armour plates to the crossbow to the other various small bits of metal on the miniature. Now for this we're going to be starting with the base coat of Iron Warriors, then we'll move on to a shade of Agrax Earthshade all over, before highlighting it with Iron Hand Steel and Storm Host Silver. Then we'll add Fugue and Orange Wash to certain areas to make it look super rusty. But first of all, it's that Iron Warriors. So first of all, let's grab our medium layer brush and let's get to it. Let's grab some of the paint from the pot here. Now we're going to add a little bit of water here, not too much when using metallic paint, just enough, perfect like that. Then onto the miniature, we're going to find all the metallic areas. So obviously on the crossbow, there's loads of metal here. All the metal parts on the man trap and the arrow here. Don't forget the chain that's around the side here and the various armour plates on the model too. Once we've undercoated all of this with Iron Warriors, we'll move on to the next stage. So that's the Iron Warriors applied all over the metal. You'll notice there's a piece of chain on the base. We're going to leave that for now and come back to it later. For now, we're going to add a wash of Agrax Earthshade using a medium layer brush all over the metal we've already applied. Just like this. Again, be careful not to hit any other parts of the model and leave about 10 to 15 minutes for it to fully dry. With the wash dry, we're now going to go back with Iron Hand Steel and very carefully pick out the raised areas and the edges. So highlighting just along the edges of the metal areas here with Iron Hand Steel. I'm using a medium layer brush here for added control. You want nice thin lines all over the edges, just like this. Next up, we're going to add a thin edge highlight of Storm Host Silver to the very, very edges of the metal plates and in the raised areas. Here we're using a small layer brush. We want really, really thin lines here. Just tiny flecks of silver along the edges like this. And last up on the metal, we're applying a wash of Fugue and Orange to the rusty springs on the crossbow here. You can also apply this wash to other parts of the metal if you want to pick them out. It's looking super rusty. Okay, so that's the metal done. It's time to move on to the next paint. Up next, we're going to use Morghast Bone for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're going to use it to highlight up the bowstrings, which we base coated Rhinox hide earlier on. We're also going to use it to base coat both the skulls and the dead animal in Hrothgorn's sack. For this, we're going to be using our medium layer brush, so let's get straight to it. Now, first of all, we'll take a little bit of paint out the pot like so, and as always, onto our palette, add just a touch of water, just to thin it down a little bit. Then, onto the miniature, we're just going to very carefully drag Morghast Bone along the bowstrings like so, very carefully picking out the higher areas and leaving the lower bits Rhinox hide as we painted earlier on. We're also going to take this colour and base coat the animal in his sack and also the skulls around the model. So make sure you're hitting the skulls here on his waist, and also make sure you're grabbing the animal in a sack here. We're not quite sure what animal it is, but it's dead. And there we go, we're going to paint that all in there as well. So there we go, the Morghast Bone has been applied. We're going to come back to those skulls and that dead animal later on. But up next, we're going to be painting the many teeth that adorn Hrothgorn, including his own teeth. And for this, we're going to be starting off with Rhinox hide as a base coat, then we'll layer up with the Shabti bone and finally use Wraith bone to highlight them. So first of all, it's Rhinox hide, and for this we're using our small layer brush to make sure we're getting lots of control. Just taking a little bit out of the pot here, adding a touch of water, but not too much. There we go. Then we're going to be picking out all the teeth all over the miniature. So have a really good look around the model as you're going. There's one up on his head here. There's a secret one hidden in his beard down here as well. Have a good look around the whole model, any teeth on this model, including Hrothgorn's teeth himself. There we go, just going to put a spot of Rhinox hide in there. Paint these all Rhinox hide, and move on to the next stage. Next up, we're adding that layer of Ushabti bone, just picking up the tips of the teeth here. Next up, we're applying a highlight of Wraith bone to the teeth. Also, while we have the paint out, we're going to highlight the bowstrings here, so just gently drag a line along the bowstrings here on the edges, like so. Also, we're going to highlight the stitches on both the gauntlet in his left hand and the back of his cap too. Up next, we're going to be painting the brass around the model. That's the brass on the gauntlet on his right arm, and also the various coins and trinkets he's got around his waist. For this, we're going to start off with a base coat of Skull Crusher brass. Then we'll wash it with Agrax Earthshade, re-highlight it with Skull Crusher brass, and finally highlight it with Stormhost silver. For this, we're using our medium layer brush, so let's grab a little bit of Skull Crusher brass out of the pot. We're going to add onto the palette here. We're not going to add much water, just a tiny amount here, just to thin it down. Then, very carefully apply it onto the model. So we're looking at the more sign here on his gauntlet, just on the right-hand side here, picking out those various teeth of that little more, and also picking out the trinkets such as the gold coins and things around his waist. There's quite a few around the back of the model as well. If you turn it around, you can see there's some down the bottom here, so don't forget those too. Next up, we're applying a wash of Agrax Earthshade to the brass we've just painted, and also the skulls that are around the miniature as well. Next up, we're applying a highlight to the brass areas with Skull Crusher brass again. This time we're using a small layer brush to get nice fine lines around the edges of the metal pieces like this. Next up, we're using Stormhost silver to apply a really thin highlight to those brass areas. Again, using a small layer brush here, just very fine lines around the edges of these brass pieces. Okay, with the brass done, it's time to finish off those skulls. We've already base coated and washed them, but now we're going to add a layer of Morghast bone over the top, and then a highlight of Ushabti bone. So with this, we're going to be using our medium layer brush. Again, I'm going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, just a touch of water here, just to make sure it goes on real smooth. And then on the skulls, we're just going to add a layer over the top of what we've already done. So just adding a layer onto the raised bits of the skulls like so. And then we're going to add a cheeky highlight of Ushabti bone to the very raised areas of the skulls. Just picking out those ridges and bits on the skull there. There we go. Okay, up next it's time to paint that poor dead animal in Hrothgorn's sack. It's probably his lunch for after the battle. Now, earlier on we've already base coated it with Morghast bone, and next time we're going to be applying a wash of Seraphim sepia. Once that's dry, we'll apply a layer of Talon sand, highlight it with Ushabti bone, and finally add gory chunks of meat with blood for the blood god. Now, first of all, we're going to be using that Seraphim sepia. So for this, we're using our medium layer brush as you want a bit more control on the wash. So we're going to take a little bit out of the pot like so, onto our palette, add a little bit of water here, not too much. There, that's perfect. And then, very carefully, onto the model, we're just going to apply onto the animal in Hrothgorn's sack there. Try as hard as you can not to hit the areas, especially that animal hide we painted earlier on. And there we go. Perfect. Once that's dry, we'll move on to the next stage. Next up, we're adding a layer with Talon sand, which we're just going to apply very carefully onto the raised parts of the animal. So look at the tail here, and also the raised parts of the animal in the sack as well, making sure you're leaving those recesses the darker colour we've painted before. Next up, we're applying a highlight of Ushabti bone, just very carefully applying it to the highest areas here. So check out the tail, and also the ridges of the animal in the bag here as well. So just the very highest parts here, just very carefully picking out the highlights here. Next up, we're going to add some blood for the blood god, which we've heavily diluted with water here, maybe about 3 parts water to 1 part blood for the blood god. So I'm going to add it in to add a little bit of gore just in the bottom of the sack here to make it look like the animal's been bleeding into the bag. Ugh. Well, the blood for the blood god has dried, and that's looking particularly disgusting. Alright, it's time to move on to the next part, and here we're going to be painting the white arrow fletchings on our huge crossbow bolt. For this, we're going to be starting off with a base coat of pallid witch flesh. We'll give it a wash of Seraphim sepia, and then we'll use white scar to highlight it. But first of all, it's that pallid witch flesh base coat, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. I'm going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, just like this. We're not going to wash this down very much, just a little bit here, just a touch to make sure it's thin to touch. Perfect. Onto the miniature, we're then going to place this pallid witch flesh very carefully onto both the actual arrow fletchings itself and the bits of string that are holding the arrow to the bolt. Next, we're adding that wash of Seraphim sepia onto the fletchings. Here we haven't diluted it at all, it's straight out of the pot, Just very carefully washing it onto the arrow fletchings and the string there. And next up here, we're using a small layer brush to add fine highlights of white scar onto the fletchings. We're actually going to use the layer brush here to just pick out the particular feathers, making it look like these are arrowhead fletchings. And with the white highlight applied, our fletchings are complete. While the white scar paint is open, we're also going to be painting the whites in the eyes of our ogre. Now this is a really small detail, so the cameras might find it hard to pick up, so I'm going to show you exactly how it works here on our palette pad. Now this is my very rough approximation of an ogre's eye. And what we're going to do is take a very, very small brush, I'm using a large one here just to demonstrate, take the white scar out of the pot, and then put in the whites of the eyes either side of the ogre's eye like so. Imagine these as tiny, tiny spots of white scar. Now doing this will mean that you've got the whites of the eyes either side of the eyeball, and then you've got the pupil in the centre like so, giving the effect of an eye. So, I'm just going to wash our brush off and show you exactly how that works with a really tiny brush. Here we're using a small layer brush. I'm going to take a dot of paint just from the pot. We're not going to water this down at all, just take a tiny, tiny dot like so. There we go. Then onto our ogre, we're just going to carefully apply it onto the either side of his eyeball like this. Hold your breath. 1 and 2. And with his eyes done, that's Throthgon himself complete. But up next we're going to be painting the big rock he stood on, and for this we'll give it a base coat of Dawnstone. Then we'll wash it with Agrat's Earthshade before dry brushing it first with Dawnstone and then with Grey Seer afterwards. First of all, it's that base coat of Dawnstone, and here we go. We're going to be using our medium layer brush for this. I'll take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, onto the palette here. Add quite a bit of water. There we go, that's perfect. Then onto the miniature, I'm just going to apply it very carefully all over the rock on his base. Now, make sure you're catching all of the rock here, and try as hard as you can not to hit the metal of his boots, because if you do, you have to go back and repaint it. Next up is a cheeky wash of Agrat's Earthshade all over the rock. Here we're using a medium layer brush, because we don't want to hit the boots, so being super careful here. Next up, we're using our small dry brush to add a very fine dry brush of Dawnstone to the rock. Be very careful here not to hit the shoes, so dry brush away from them whenever you get a chance. Next up, open your pot of Grey Seer again and add a fine dry brush to the very edges of the rocks here. Again, dry brush away from the shoes here to avoid hitting the boots. And with the rock on his base done, Throthgon's just about finished, all by his base, which we'll come back to later on. And now Throthgon's done, it's time to have a look at his trusty saber-tusk Thrafnir. So let's have a look at what we've already painted. Now on Thrafnir, we'll have a look here. His hide's been painted the same way as the white cloak on Throthgon's back. The black's been painted the same way as his boot leather. The teeth, the skulls and the straps have all been painted the same way as we did on Throthgon as well. In fact, the only thing we've got left to paint on this miniature is his mane. We're going to start off by painting the mane with Stormvermin fur. We'll give it a wash of Agrat's Earthshade. Then we'll wash the deep recesses with Rhinox hide mixed with Lamian medium. Then we'll add dry brushes of Stormvermin fur, Dawnstone and Grey Seer over the top to finish it off. First of all, it's that base coat of Stormvermin fur. For this we're using our medium layer brush. Again, we're taking a touch of paint out of the pot like so, just adding a little bit of water here from the pot just to thin it down. Then, very carefully, we're going to add this base coat onto Thrafnir's mane here. Now be very careful here not to hit any parts of the model that are the white parts. If you do, you can always go back with a touch of Grey Seer paint and touch it up. Also, make sure you avoid his ears here. You don't want to paint those the same colour as the mane. With the base coat done, we're applying a wash of Agrat's Earthshade here all over the mane. Again, we're using a medium layer brush here to be super careful not to hit the grey and white areas, but if you do, just go back with a pot of Grey Seer and touch it up. Next up, just to add some more colour into the mane, we've mixed up some Rhinox hide with Lamian medium, about 3 parts medium to 1 part Rhinox hide. I'm just going to drop it very carefully into the deepest recesses on the mane. Also going to concentrate around the neck here as well, just to add a spice of colour there. Once that's dry, we're hitting the mane with a dry brush of Stormvermin fur again. Here we're using our small dry brush to make sure it's super neat. Up next, we're applying another dry brush, this time with Dawnstone. We're concentrating near the tops of the tips of the hair here and around the edges like so. And the last dry brush is Grey Seer. Here we're just applying it to the very tips of the mane like so. And with the dry brush on the mane done, Thrafnir is complete and ready for basing. So, up next, let's have a look at the Nobbler trappers that accompany Hrothgorn into the Beast's Grave. First of all, we're going to be painting the skin on Bushwhacker to show you how that's done. So, for this, we're going to be using Deathweld Forest as a base coat. Let's grab our medium layer brush and get straight to it. We're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, and onto our palette like this. Again, we're just going to add a little bit of water like this. Then, onto our Nobbler miniature, we're just going to paint very carefully on the skin. So, try as hard as you can to avoid anything else. You'll notice actually that we haven't painted anything else on the Nobbler already. That's because the skin's important to paint first. Once that's done, we're going to paint the rest of it later on. But here we go, the base coat's going down nice and neat. Apply it all over the skin of your Nobbler trapper. And once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. And there we go, the Deathweld Forest base coat has been applied onto our Novelist Flesh. So up next after that, we're going to be applying a wash of Athonian camo shade all over the flesh. Once that's dry, we'll apply layers of Deathweld Forest and Elysium Green, both mixed with Lamian Medium. Then we'll apply a highlight of Ogren camo, and finally we're going to add some Caribou Crimson onto our Nobbler's lips to make them stand out. But first of all, it's time for that Athonian camo shade wash, and for this we're using our medium shade brush, so let's get onto that. We'll take a little bit of wash out of the pot like so, and onto the palette like this. We're not going to be watering this down very much, because we want it to be quite a strong pigment, but we just want to make sure we're not overloading our brush with too much paint. Perfect. Then onto our Nobbler, we're just going to very carefully apply it all over his flesh like so. You can afford to be quite heavy with this and make mistakes if you like, because we haven't painted the rest of the model. Just apply it all over, make sure the wash isn't pooling in any areas, so make sure you're just moving it around like that. Once that's dry, it'll be time to start the layering. Once the wash is dry, we're applying a layer of Deathweld Forest over the top. Here we've mixed it with Lamian Medium to thin it down a little bit. We're just picking out the raised areas of the skin, leaving the lower areas that darker colour we've just painted. The next highlight is Elysium Green. Here we've added a little bit of Lamian Medium once again, just to thin the paint down to make it a bit more subtle when it goes on. Now the Nobbler's flesh here is quite a small and intricate detail, so here we've switched to a small layer brush just to make painting the layers a little easier. Next up, we're applying fine highlights of Ogren camo onto the edges of the muscles, just like this. This is super fine work, so again we're using a small layer brush here, and just take your time, just make sure you're picking out the muscles, just like that. Once that highlight's done, we're going to apply a very, very careful wash of Caribou Crimson to the bottom of our Nobbler's lip here, just the bottom lip, just to make it stand out. We're also going to apply it onto his ears as well, the earlobes, just like this. And with the Caribou Crimson wash complete, Bushwhacker's flesh is done. So let's move on to his beady little evil red eye next, and for this we're going to be going back to our pot of Wordbearer Red. It's such a small fine detail, we're going to be using our small layer brush, and we've got a super fine point on it ready to go. So here's how we're going to do it. First of all, we're going to take just a tiny pinprick of paint from the pot like so. Make sure you're just getting paint on the very end of the brush like that. Then onto the model, we're just going to paint very carefully. Now we're going to brace our hand against the paint handle like this. Very carefully just add a dot of Wordbearer Red into his eyes, like so. Hold your breath. There's one. And there's the second one. There we go, his eyes are done, and he's looking particularly evil and nasty. So let's have a look at how we're going to paint the rest of the Nobbler. Now for this we're going to go back to earlier on in the video and actually use techniques we used on Hrothgorn himself, and here's how we're going to do it. Now let's have a look at the model here. We're just going to use the red technique from Hrothgorn's Loincloth to paint his cloth front here. We'll use various parts of leather we used on the model earlier on to paint the leather straps. We'll use the teeth method to paint his teeth and his claws, and we'll use the metal method to paint the man trap and the trap on his shoulder as well. And there we go, Bushwhacker has been fully painted using the techniques seen earlier in this video. You can use all of these techniques to fully paint all the Nobblers in your warband. Okay, so now it's time to do the last thing on the models, and that's of course to paint the bases. Now all the bases are going to be the same in our warband. We're going to show you how it works on Hrothgorn himself. Now first of all, we're going to start off with a base coat of Corvus Black all over the top of the base. Then we'll dry brush the base with both Dawnstone and Grey Seer. First of all, that base coat of Corvus Black. For this we're using our medium base brush. So let's take a little bit of the paint out of the pot like so, and onto the palette like this. When you're painting a base like this, it's a good idea to just water the paint down a little bit to help it go on the model a lot easier. There we go, a bit more water, perfect. Then onto the model, we're just going to apply it very carefully onto the top of the base. Now the reason we didn't paint the details on the base earlier on is so you can afford to be a little bit messy now. You can see there's a bone I'm painting over here, not a problem. We're going to come back to that later on and paint the details in. But for now we're painting the ground parts of these base. Just make sure you're painting it fully all over. Once that's dry, we'll move on to the next stage. Next up, we're going to hit the top of the base with a dry brush of Dawnstone. Here we're using a small dry brush to make sure we're not hitting any parts of the model we don't want to hit. Next up is a light dry brush of Grey Seer onto the top of the base. Don't worry if you hit the details on the base, like the bone or the chain here. We're about to paint those in a minute. And there we go, the dry brushing on top of the base is done. Alright, so the next stage for the base itself is to pick out the rest of the details using techniques seen earlier in this video. Let's have a look and see what I'm talking about. So on our model here, we've got a bone at the front here. We'll use the bone technique from earlier on to paint that. We've also got a chain here. We'll use the metal technique to paint that as well. Some of the bases have skulls and rocks on as well. Just use the techniques seen earlier on in this video to fully paint those bases. Once that's done, move on to the next stage. And there we go. We've painted the details on the base using the techniques seen earlier in this video. Alright, up next it's time to add some texture to the base. We're going to start off with some grassy tufts in the form of Moortime turf. Now Moortime turf tufts come on a sheet like this, and you can use a pair of side cutters to easily place them onto your miniature. Here's how you do it. So first of all, we're going to grab hold of the sheet here and just carefully take one of the tufts off the base with a pair of side cutters. Then onto the model, we're going to apply it very carefully onto the base, like so. It actually sticks down by itself, you don't have to glue it at all. You want about 2 or 3 of these per base to make it look all grassy, and once you've done that, we'll move on to the next stage. With the grass tufts added, it's time for the next stage, and that's to add some snow onto the base using Valhallan Blizzard to make it look like the frozen wasteland that Hrothgorn hails from. For this we're using our texture tool, so let's get straight to it. Take a little bit of Valhallan Blizzard out of the pot like so, just a small amount on the thin end of the tool here, and then onto the miniature. I'm just going to apply it very carefully onto the base. Now it's entirely your taste as to how much Valhallan Blizzard you put on the base. You could cover the base if you wanted to, or add small patches like I am. Either way, allow about half an hour for it to fully dry. Once it has, we'll paint the rim of the base with a Baden black. So there we go, the base is done, and that's how you paint the bases for all the miniatures in your warband. Alright, that's how you paint Hrothgorn's man-trappers. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting!